Okay, so here we are, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, maybe not quite that much. One of the things, side note, and I can't believe it took me so long to figure it out, is the little blue thing here, you can move your screen to the left and to the right. I was wondering how it was done, and I kept zooming out to add things, but that moves left and right. And this little one right here, maybe I'll just circle it so you can really see it. This little blue one, if you click on that, that's how you move up and down. And so it took me a little bit to figure that one out. But, and I thought maybe some of you might have that same issue. Okay, what we're going to do is I would like to make an enemy, and there's a built-in enemy here. So I'm going to add a new object, and I'm going to, oops. I don't want a text object. I accidentally clicked that, sorry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new object, and because I'm using the online one, it's going to come up with a sprite, and I'm going to call this enemy. And I'm going to add animation, and I'm limited to the ones on here, but there's a good one. Slime walk, and I don't know why they didn't make this an animation. There's just one. So if I want to make another, they have 2 frames of it. So if I want to add the second frame, I'm just going to go add, and I'm going to add the second slime walk. So there's slime walk 1 and slime walk 2, and it just gives a little bit of animation. In fact, I'm going to preview it, and I'm going to change the timing. It kind of wiggles a bit fast here, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the frame rate down to maybe 4, something like that. So 0.25. And now he just sort of pulses, and I kind of like that. It gives it a little bit more movement, Mr. Slime Enemy, some movement. So object enemy, and I can give it a name if I wanted. I'll just call it animation 0 and leave it as is. Great. The second thing I want to do is make a variable for this enemy that we just made. And before we've made a global variable, but it's better to have variables that are local to things. And so with the enemy, one of the variables I want is a variable that's going to keep track of the direction. Am I moving to the left or am I moving to the right? And so what I'm going to do is click on the 3 dots. And instead of editing the object, this time I'm going to edit the object variables. So when I want to create an object variable, I'm just going to click add. The variable is going to be called direction. And I'll put a little check mark. And the value I'm going to give it is some text, which is going to be called left. So left when I move left, and then I'll put the word right when I move right. And one of the things to note at this point is make sure if I capitalize the L in left, that anytime I refer to it, it's going to have a capital L, because a lowercase and capital are 2 different things. And I know new programmers often get mixed up with those sorts of things. So L, capital L for left, capital R for right, and I'm going to constantly do that as I go through here. The other thing to note is variables shouldn't have spaces. And so you'll see I have no spaces here. Okay, so it doesn't look like anything's different, but this enemy now has a direction. Great. I'm just going to put the enemy on the screen here. And one of the things I want is I want the enemy to start moving, and like a Goomba, when it hits the ladder here, I want it to turn around. And when it hits the edge here, I want it to go back and forth. So to do that, what we're going to do is I'm going to create a left and right block. And so I'm going to click on the plus to add a new object. And this object, I'll call this enemy wall right. And I'm going to add an animation. And so this, I'll select the right arrow. Here it is. The right arrow. So this wall points right, and when the enemy hits it, it's going to want to make the enemy move right. I'm going to make another object. So again, I add a new object, and this one I'm going to call enemy wall left. And again, I'll select the animation for the left hitbox. So now I've got an enemy wall left. And I've moved it just a little bit over here. I can sort of choose where I decide to put it. Enemy wall right. Looks pretty good. And so if the enemy is going to hit it, I can add events and actions that are going to make the enemy move to the left or move to the right. So let's start by going to my game events. And so here we have my game events, and we finished with the score last day. So what I'm going to do is we're going to add another group. So I'll call this group something like enemies, or enemy actually. So here we go. So all the things to do with the enemy are going to go in here. So one of the first things I want to do is I don't want to see, I don't want to see the left and right triggers. And so what I can do here is I can go to my game event, and the first event I might add here. So I'll stick it, and don't forget you have to sort of pull it in so it attaches to the group above. And this is going to be at the beginning of the scene. So I type in at the beginning of the scene and say, okay. What I want to do is I want to hide the right wall, and I'm going to duplicate this. So I use Control C, Control V, or you can go through the same process again. And I want to hide the enemy wall. And notice as I start deleting characters, there's no space in here. And as I start deleting, it will type the ones that it knows of, the objects. And in this case, it makes it quick to toggle between those. Great. And so now when I press play, you'll see I've got a enemy, and he can't see the walls. Great. The enemy's not moving though. So I want to get the enemy to start moving. And so what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to use the variable. So let's add another event here. And this event is going to be the text. I want to look for the text. So I want to look for objects. So common conditions for all objects. And you'll see under common conditions for all objects, there's variables. And I want the text of an object. The reason I'm not looking at the value is because even though you could say left is a value or right is a value, they're actually text words. And remember I was talking that you had to capital the L for left or R for right, that was really fussy. Well, that's because we're actually going to see if a word exists spelt and capitalized exactly the same. So that's why we're going to use text. If it was value, we'd be using numbers like 0 or 1. And I certainly could do that. I could say 0 represents left and 1 represents right. But it makes more logical sense when I'm coding just to use the word left and the word right. So let's do that. So what I'm going to say is I want to do the text of a variable. And what variable? The enemy variable called. And when I click on object enemy, so the variable is associated with the object enemy. The variable is called direction. And is it equal to, and notice there's quotation marks. And this is kind of a glitch because you have to have quotation marks, and you'd think that it shows you quotation marks, but you actually have to put in quotation mark, let's say right. So if the value is the word RIGHT, if that's true, what we're going to do is I want to move it right. So the action is called a force. So I want to add to enemy, I want to add a force. And you could type in force, add a force to move an object. So add a force. And the force I want to add it to is the enemy. And I'm going to say, let's add 40, or choose a number that you think is good. But I'm going to say 40 pixels per second on the X coordinate, X axis, and say OK. And so if the word in direction was right, we'd add 40 points moving right. And I'm going to copy this, or let me do it again, just so you can see it, how I did it again. So what I did is I wanted to go to common conditions for all objects, and I wanted variable, and I wanted a text variable of the enemy. And the variable I want is direction, and is it equal to, and in quotation marks, capital L-E-F-T. So in the characters L-E-F-T, not the quotation marks, are what it's going to look for. Quotation just means that it's a string, it's text. So it's going to look for the character L-E-F-T, the word left, and that is what we actually had originally set in our variable, was the word left. And so what I want it to do is I want it to do the same thing here. I wanted to add the force. So a quick way I can copy, and I can click on here. Oops. Maybe it's not quick because I didn't click in the right spot. Copy. And why isn't paste? There you go. And paste. But instead of 40, I wanted to change it to -40. And I'm just getting used to the tools here. There's and showing you shortcuts. Although that didn't seem too much shorter, did it? So anyhow, in this case, I want to add -40 to make it go the opposite direction. Great. So now what you're going to see is if I hit play, the enemy is going to start moving to the left. And when it hits the right arrow, it didn't do anything. It's just going to keep going. Oh, because I didn't tell it to do anything. I need to tell it that when it hits the right arrow, that it's going to change. So when it hits the enemy wall right, I want the variable, the enemy's variable direction to be the word right. And so I want it to start moving to the right. And again, just if you can't remember where the variable was, if I click on the enemy here, and I select edit object variables, you'll see there's a variable called direction, and it was set to the value capital L-E-F-T. Notice there's no quotation marks. The quotation marks are just used to designate that it is text. Okay, and that's common in most programming languages. We tend to do that, by the way. So let's go back to our code and what we want to do. So if it's left, it moves left. If it's right, it moves right. But I want it when it hits the wall to change the direction. And so what we're going to do next is I'm going to have a collision with the enemy wall. So to do that, let's add a new empty event. And I'm going to look for a collision. All sorts of different ways to do that. So I want a collision between the enemy and the right wall. So the wall that says, great, let's go to the right. And so I press OK. So if the enemy hits the wall right, what are we going to do? What I want to do is I want to change that variable. So to change a variable, I'm going to go add action, common for all, and I'm going to say variable, the variable of an object, and the object is enemy, and the variable is direction. And I'm going to set the direction now to be, in quotation marks, right. So now the word right is what the text is going to be. So right means that it's going to go to the right. And basically, I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I can copy and paste this whole event, and I'll just do it real quick here. Oops. I need to select the whole thing. So this time I want to say if the enemy is in the collision with the wall left, I'm going to change the direction of the enemy from the word right to the word left. And what this should do is, I'll play this one more time. What this should do, you'll see the enemy now goes this way and hits a wall and then goes that way. Now notice he should also flip over. So I'm going to change the animation. So he flips over, and let's just close this off, and easy to do. So if it's right, what I'm going to do is not only do I want to change the direction to right, but I also want to add an action, which is a common for the objects, and that is the, I want to do the flip horizontal. And actually, sorry, that's not common for all objects. That's under the, I'll just type flip. Sometimes it's easier. Flip object horizontally, easier to find sometimes. So I'm going to take the enemy and I'm going to say, yes, let's flip the enemy. And I say, okay. And so now it's going to change the text to say right, and it's going to flip it. And then when if it's going right, it's going to move 40 pixels on the X. If I'm going left, I'm going to do the same thing. So I type flip, I flip horizontally. This time I'm going to say the enemy is a no for active, because it's going to stick with the same that we originally had. And so it's just going to flip it and back to the original. And the text is left. So now you'll see it should start to go to the left and to the right and to the left and to the right. And then the last thing we're going to need to do is make a collision with the player and the enemy. So the enemy is going back and forth here, and we got to watch out for him. The graphics look good. The last thing we have, though, is if I hit him, nothing is going to happen. So let's see if I've got time. I've got a meeting coming up, but let me just see if I can add one last real quick thing, which is a collision event. So there's going to be two collisions. So the collision, I'll just type in here, collision between the player and the enemy. Great. So if the player collides with the enemy, now we're getting so many things here. If the player collides with the enemy, what I want to do here is I want to delete the enemy. And we're going to add more things to this as well. So I'll just type in delete an object, and I would delete the player. But I don't want to delete the player always, because if the player is only on the ground, I want to delete the player. So what I need to do is add another condition to this collision player and enemy. And this time I'm going to say that if the enemy is on in the enemy event, what I want to, or not the enemy event, the player event, I want to see it's a platform behavior. And what I want to, I lost my mouse. There you go. Platform behavior. And I want to say is on the floor. So if the enemy is on the floor, so if player is on the floor, then and he collides, then the player loses. But if the player's not on the floor, then I want to delete the enemy. So I can add that as well. And so let's go and do that now. So we'll add one more. So I'm going to copy this. Boy, it gets, as I get running a room, I need a bigger screen here. So I'll copy this. And what I want to do is player, and I want to delete the enemy. And I want the, if player is not on the floor. And so I'm just going to invert it. So if I'm not on the floor, then I delete the enemy. And there you have it. So hopefully this is working. And next, we're going to, we can do other things as well. We can have lives and those sorts of things. But we'll just stop for now.